With over 30 books across multiple series, one could pretty easily argue that Five Nights at Freddy's is more of a book franchise than a game one at this point. And given the different methods of storytelling and conveying information between the books and the games, there's a lot of information we just wouldn't have without the books. However, what causes a bit of an issue when theorizing is the question of how and if information from the books should be used, especially with recent debates over just how canon they are to the games. As such, with the final book in the recent Tales from the Pizzaplex series coming out, I think it's important to go over just how useful and usable the books are for actually understanding the lore of the games. So sit back and consider subscribing, because hopefully by the end of this video, you'll have a pretty good idea of what the Five Nights at Freddy's books bring to the table. Generally speaking, all the books can be separated into 4 different series or categories: the Silverized novel trilogy, Fazbear Frights, Tales from the Pizzaplex, and informational books, with a couple of outliers that don't exactly fit into any category. In this video, I'm going to be focusing primarily on the first 3 narrative-style series, as that's typically where the most debate shows up around their use in the games. Each category functions a little differently with how and what it does with the information they have, but once you've got the differences ironed out and know where to look for information, it's not too difficult to decide how you want to approach the books for theorizing. For starters, the Silverized trilogy was the first instance of the franchise branching into the world of literature, and due to the pretty major plot differences between it and the story of the games, franchise creator Scott Cawthon made a post after the first book's release that not only helped clear up just how relevant the stories are to the games, but also established the canon versus continuity difference that's important to be aware of when talking about various aspects of the FNAF franchise. In that post, Scott explained that because lore could get so crowded that original stories couldn't be told, the Silverized was not made with the intention of solving anything from the games, which at that time weren't supposed to continue past FNAF 4, and that the games and the books should be considered to be separate continuities, even if they do share many familiar elements. Most fans of the franchise are somewhat aware of this alternate continuity situation, but the next part of Scott's post is something that often gets overlooked, and it's that the book is canon, just as the games are. Typically, when people use the term canon, they mean it in the sense that something is an official part of the true story. For example, Elizabeth Afton is canonically the name of the spirit-possessing circus baby. However, Scott's approach has a bit of a distinction to this, with canon referring to all of the Five Nights at Freddy's storylines of the franchise, but continuity distinguishing them between timelines. Each of the books and stories is something that could plausibly happen within the setting and world mechanics of the series, but what exactly happens is going to be different between the continuity of the novel trilogy and the continuity of the games. For instance, in the games, William Afton got springlocked due to triggering the springlocks himself after getting chased into the spring Bonnie suit by the spirits of the kids he killed. But in the end of the Silverized, Charlie Emily triggers the springlocks of the suit that he was wearing to attack her and her friends. However, this doesn't mean that there is no overlap between the books and the games, and that's where I think a lot of people tend to get confused. I've often seen people assume that because the games and the books are different continuities, that means that they're completely irrelevant to each other. But even in his post, right after saying that the games and the books should be considered separate continuities, Scott specifically clarified even if they do share many familiar elements. And if we take a look at the novel trilogy and compare it to the games, we can see that at play. In both continuities, William Afton killed 5 kids at Freddy Fazbear's Pizza in the 80s, who then went on to possess Freddy, Bonnie, Chica, Foxy, and Golden Freddy, even if the exact spirits to do so are slightly different in each universe. In both timelines, his daughter Elizabeth Afton is the one who possesses the Circus Baby animatronic, even if Circus Baby's exact origins differ. Henry and Charlie Emily are both characters in both continuities, but while we know it's them in the games, we only ever see Henry's name in abbreviated form, and Charlie's name is only ever shown in the files for Security Breach. So we only know it's them because of the character relationship between William and Henry that was established in the Silverized. So while the novel trilogy is definitely distinct from the games, it isn't 100% disconnected, especially since Scott originally wrote them not planning to continue the game series, but then had the games he made after the books were published rely quite heavily on the characters and world building introduced in the novels. Because of this, I think Scott's statement that the novels aren't intended to solve the games is mostly referring to the timeline side of the games up to the point he started making the books, and more specific events, as the mechanics he sets up for how souls, emotions, and memories interact with the world are something that carries over between continuities. As such, I use the novel trilogy to explain the mechanics of the world and the reasoning behind certain things in the games. Why do the spirits attack the guards who don't look like their killer? Why didn't the spirits attack William when he got in the spring Bonnie suit? I found that the Silverized trilogy is helpful for questions like these, though I'm very careful to cross-reference for the games for any evidence there and to accommodate for continuity differences, as well as the other books for clarification and to see what stays constant across continuities. Speaking of the other books, next up on the list is the Fazbear Frights series, and the approach I recommend taking with this series is a bit different, mostly because Scott's approach to making the series was a bit different. More specifically, while the Silver Eyes trilogy wasn't made with the intention of answering questions about the game world, Fazbear Frights was, with Scott saying that some of the characters and plotlines in Frights would connect directly to the games, and that while new games would look to the future of the franchise, the books would fill in some of the blanks to the past, and boy does it do just that. The man in room 1280 clarified that William Afton was the one experiencing Ultimate Custom Night as a nightmare coma inflicted by the vengeful spirit of one of his victims, rather than it being Mike being tormented by the crying child, or it just literally being purgatory. What we found takes place at the Fazbear's Fright location from FNAF 3, and it clarifies how the Phantom animatronics may have come to be in that game. And the Stitch Wraith epilogues and various stories give pretty in-depth explanation of what Remnant is and how it works, which is pretty useful given Remnant is the fundamental mechanic of how possession functions in the first place. We can also get probable confirmation of the year that William killed the kids at Freddy's, as while 6 kids are killed in Frights instead of the 5 in the games in the novel trilogy, both the trilogy and Frights have the murders happen in the year 1985. Most of it is information you can get from the games if you know where to look and make the right guesses, but Frights does wonders for actually nailing some things down, though I will certainly admit it has its weirder stories as well. In any case, when there is a connection between Frights and the games, it's definitely something to pay attention to, but it is still important to be aware of, you guessed it, continuity differences. While they aren't as obvious in every story of Fazbear Frights, like they are generally pretty dang obvious in the novel trilogy, there are some pretty notable ones, including but not limited to the aforementioned differing numbers of kids killed in the missing children's incident, with one of said kids having her hair color changed for some reason, FNAF 3 starring some random guy who dies and starts a fire by climbing in an oven after one night instead of the actual 5 nights of the guy who's actually probably a relevant character doing his job, and Charlie getting dumped in a lake along with William when in the games her tearless mask, which wouldn't have been produced by Fazbear as the tears became the official design after her death pretty early on in the timeline, is present in the blob during security breach. Once again, there are likely others I didn't mention, but these are some that I find notable. Because of some of these continuity differences, combined with Scott saying that some characters and plotlines are directly connected to the games while others aren't, there's a somewhat popular theory called Stitchline Games, which is essentially that certain stories, namely the epilogues about the Stitch Wraith and any story connected to the epilogues, are game continuity, while the others are their own continuity. While I see the reasoning for this, there are a few reasons why I disagree. For one, the story involving a 6th kid getting killed by William is part of the Stitchline, and unless Scott randomly decided to backtrack his statement about not retconning things on a whim to add in an extra kid, I find it rather unlikely that it could be game canon. Similarly, Charlie getting dumped in the lake is part of the epilogues, which once again is very much so part of the Stitchline but doesn't line up with what we see in Security Breach. However, I think the main issue actually comes from the interpretation of Scott's statement. For Stitchline to work, that relies on Scott saying that some characters and plots being connected to the games, meaning that some of the Fright stories are directly identical to the games. I would already have some skepticism about that, given that would mean half of Frights isn't canon to itself, but the thing is, connected doesn't mean the same, it just means related or associated. And what Scott really said was that the books would have 3 different short stories with unique characters and plot lines, some connected directly to the games and some not. The phrasing implies it's the characters and plot lines that are occasionally connected to the games, and we can see this throughout Frights in various non-canon to the games ways. What we found is directly connected to FNAF 3 in the location and some similar events, but it doesn't actually match the events and characters we see in the game. Step Closer has a character named Pete who connects to Michael Afton through parallels such as picking on his younger brother, liking gum, and staying alive after his death. But he very clearly is not Michael Afton in several obvious ways. Room for One More takes place in Circus Baby's Entertainment and Rentals, and as such is connected with sister location, but the characters, timing, and events of the stories are different. The series is full of connections and parallels and explanations for things, but maintains the differences to make it still its own continuity. Because of this, with Frights, I build upon my strategy of cross-referencing and examining world mechanics and use it for the parallels it contains. Even if the characters and events in the stories have their differences from the games, there are enough similarities between situations and characters to whereby examining what happens in one continuity, we can make a pretty educated guess about what may have happened in the other while maintaining the separation between the game series and the book series. Fazbear Frights Tales from the Pizzaplex, on the other hand, almost blurs that line of separation entirely. As far as I know, Scott hasn't made any statement on it as the series released after he took a step back from interacting with the fanbase as much, but when you look at Tales, there is a lot there that doesn't just connect to the plot and characters of the games, but confirms some theories about them, such as Gregory being both behind the high scores on the arcade cabinets at the Pizzaplex and being patient 46, and the series introduces us to new characters that eventually make an appearance in the games, like the Mimic Endo, who, despite FNAF Twitter/X's protests, I am still very confident is not Burntrap, but this video is not the time or place for that discussion. My point is, Tales has a lot in common with the games, to the point that rather than people suggesting only certain stories are game continuity along the lines of Stitchline, the popular theory, as far as I can tell, is Tales games, that all of Tales from the Pizzaplex is canon to the games. However, the pretty immediate and widespread acceptance for a large portion of the community of Tales games as fact has led to a few issues. For one, I've seen a lot of people say that because all the stories are canon to the games, that means that there cannot be parallels, and they use that to dismiss theories. The thing is, there can be parallels while also having a story be part of the same continuity. Even if Tales is game continuity, the stories in the series still focus on different characters than the games do, and even if those characters do exist in the game line, they can still be parallels to other characters within the same continuity and with how their stories work. A story or a character being a parallel to another doesn't make them mutually exclusive, and I think that's important to be aware of. The second issue with taking Tales from the Pizzaplex as game canon is that to avoid continuity differences, it is absolutely necessary to pick and choose what details you think were intentional and which you think were just accidents that you can ignore for convenience. This is particularly a problem when the continuity issue in question would absolutely shatter the game continuity's timeline, and the supposed error takes place in one of the most important plot lines in Tales, the origin of the Mimic. We're given enough information in The Mimic and the Storyteller that we can put together a pretty solid understanding of when the events mentioned in each story take place. To start, we're told that Edwin, the man who created the Mimic, started his company that he eventually sold to Fazbear Entertainment around the same time he graduated college and got married in the early 70s. To be as generous as possible, we're going to go with the latest early 70s date of 1974 for him to graduate college, and assume that he graduated and got married at 21. You can push it younger if you really want, but it honestly doesn't change that much. We also find out that Edwin was 24 when his wife was still alive and pregnant with his son David. For this specifically, some people try to say that the stories contradict themselves, and Edwin was actually 24 when the Mimic was built, but this seems to just be a misunderstanding based on the phrasing of one of the segments that mentions this. In the segment in question, Edwin is mid-flashback sequence about how he was excited to pass on his legacy to his, at the time, unborn child he had just found out about, and it's mentioned that for most of his 24 years of life he had had a passion for robotics, before then referencing his present-day son's age to talk about when that passion started. People assume that the reference to David's current age means that the flashback had ended and that the 24 years is referring to Edwin's current age as well. But given the storyteller backs up that he was 24 before David was born, and you can very easily also interpret this portion to be referring to Edwin's mental state at the time he was 24, and that modern Edwin is only using his son's age because he's the one having the flashback, this is likely more a phrasing issue than an actual error. In any case, if Edwin graduated college in 1974 at 21 years old, he would be 24 3 years later in 1977. This means that the storyteller, which takes place 40 years after that when Edwin is 64 years old, takes place in the year 2017. Additionally, by this point, Edwin has been working at Fazbear Entertainment for about 5 years, as he created the Mimic 5 years after his wife was pregnant, and then after the events of the Mimic, he traveled for 30 years before coming back to work at Fazbear Entertainment. This means that not only did Edwin start working for a fully functional Fazbear Entertainment in the likely latest of 2012, but Freddy Fazbear's Mega Pizzaplex was fully open and operational in the year 2017. Why is this a problem, you ask? Two things: FNAF 3 and Freddy Fazbear's Pizzeria Simulator. FNAF 3 takes place 30 years after Freddy's shut down, and as the last Freddy's was open in FNAF 1 during 1993, that puts FNAF 3 in the year 2023, which is backed up by Henry's tapes during Pizzeria Simulator's Insanity ending being labeled as HRY 223. So unless those numbers are completely arbitrary, they were probably recorded in the year 2023. And you know what was built on top of the Pizzeria Simulator location? The Pizzaplex. You can probably see why this is an issue in the context of Tales games. Even if the 2023 date isn't correct for FNAF 3, and it was 30 years after the first Freddy's closed instead of the last, and we say that the 223 in the HRY tape is completely arbitrary. That would still put FNAF 3 in 2015, several years after Edwin had started working back at Fazbear Entertainment. That would put real quick turnaround on Pizzeria Simulator being after FNAF 3 and leading to Fazbear Entertainment no longer being a corporate entity and then suddenly coming back with extreme popularity, having the indie dev make games and making Help Wanted in response, and then building and maintaining a fully operational Pizzaplex in less than a span of 2 years. And this isn't the only strange discrepancy with the games. The Pizzaplex in the books is circular, while the game Pizzaplex definitely is not. The indie dev from Help Wanted in the books dies before finishing the 4th game Fazbear asked him to make, but in the games we hear that Fazbear has pending lawsuits against him, which wouldn't exactly work if he was dead. Heck, even minor things like the Mr. Hippo fridge magnet having been recalled in the books due to the way they interfered with the machinery, while in Security Breach Gregory is given one as a free prize showing they have not been recalled, shows that there are continuity differences between the game timeline and Tales, and that is absolutely something to be aware of and acknowledge. When I point this out, people tend to assume that I'm saying to completely ignore all the important lore reveals in Tales, or that it's impossible for the writers to make mistakes, and that's not the case at all. I think that Tales is great for giving us pretty strong confirmation of things, and while I generally have an explanation for what people often use as evidence of definitive mistakes, I do understand that point of view and acknowledge that, as human beings, we are all flawed. The issue is that even if the majority of elements between continuities is shared, if there are differences between the two, which there definitely are, you can't just assume that everything carries over. Similarly, if you estimate one date or time span to be an error, using another as definitive evidence of something without cross-referencing that with another continuity where it is in fact definitively the case, would be ill-advised since you would have to be willing to apply the potential error logic for both. And that's assuming there was even an error in the first place and there isn't actually an explanation for whatever the issue is. So do I think Tales Games is canon? No, but I do think it has enough in common that it is intentionally giving insight into how a lot more aspects of the game work. As such, my advice is to use the games as a base, cross-reference it with the information in Tales, and if things work out, it probably carries over. And if not, just go with the information in the games. But honestly, you can choose to use the books to theorize however you want and just come up with whatever conclusion you think is right. I just recommend to keep in mind that no matter how right you think you are, there's always going to be someone out there who disagrees, and it's important to be respectful of that, you know? Whether you believe Stitchline games or Tales games or games doesn't really matter, as long as you're having fun discussing the franchise with other people. But hey, these are just my own interpretations and you're absolutely entitled to yours. Please consider subscribing and sharing this video if you thought it was helpful in any way, or leave a comment to let me know what you think. Thanks for watching, don't get stabbed, and have a nice day.